You know, gaming YouTubers have gained a certain reputation for just complaining all the time. But despite what my Mystic Quest video led some to believe, I don't set out to make my videos inherently negative. I'll bring up criticisms where I think they're fair, but I also go out of my way to give each game its fair due. Game development takes a lot of time, talent, and hard work, and I don't want to disparage any team that was just trying to make a good product. And since the whole point of this video series is that I'm reviewing games I already personally own, it of course makes sense that I wouldn't have gone out of my way to buy a game that I wasn't confident I'd enjoy, to at least some extent. Some of these games I've owned and played for decades. Others I've had sitting around but have simply never gotten around to playing them. And others still I buy on a whim, out of recommendation or word of mouth alone. And Secret of Mana fits in that last category. It's a game I've been aware of for most of my time as a gamer, and if you're anyone who's remotely into the JRPG genre, you've no doubt at least heard of it. It's considered a classic, one that pushed new boundaries and redefined what RPG combat could be, and with a visual style and soundtrack that won the hearts of RPG lovers the world over. Secret of Mana is a game I desperately wanted to love, but upon finally playing it, I honestly don't know what to make of it. Secret of Mana is a sequel to Final Fantasy Adventure, which in Japan was called Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. Yes, despite all the people claiming otherwise, the Mana series was labeled as a Final Fantasy spin-off, even in Japan. Originally, Secret of Mana was codenamed Project Chrono Trigger, but development would eventually split into two teams. One group would go on to create, well, Chrono Trigger, while the other would make Secret of Mana. FF Adventure director Koichi Ishii returned for the Mana project alongside Final Fantasy III game designer Hiromichi Tanaka, who joined the Mana team after stepping down from FF4. As such, a lot of his ideas for that game would be incorporated here, namely action-based combat and a cohesive and dynamic world map. And he would also be placed in charge of the game's story. Also from the FF3 team was programmer Nasir Jabeli, who briefly returned to Square after a years-long break following the renewal of his work visa. Hiromichi Tanaka has said that in many ways, Secret of Mana itself is a spiritual sequel to Final Fantasy III, greatly expanded and reimagined for the Super Nintendo. Secret of Mana tells the tale of a boy named Randy, who is banished from his village after accidentally claiming the legendary Mana Sword from its resting place, unleashing monsters into the surrounding lands. But encouraged by the wandering hero Gemma to restore power to the sword by visiting the 8 Mana Temples, Randy embarks on a world-spanning quest to thwart the evil empire attempting world domination, as well as find a way to restore the world's waning source of mana, the mystical force that gives life to all. Secret of Mana follows in the footsteps of Final Fantasy Adventure, featuring Zelda-inspired action combat with the player's attacks utilizing a power meter that determines the strength of each strike. Mashing the button to mindlessly swing your weapon is futile, as swings executed at any less than 100% power will fail to make any sort of significant dent on enemies, giving every attack a clear wind-up and cooldown period. In a way, this mimics the turn-based nature of the typical RPGs of the time, but in a real-time setting. Characters can move and attack as the player wants, but waiting for the ideal time to strike is essential, as in addition to the power meter, enemies are also granted mercy frames as well as power up and cooldown just like the player is, so attacking at just the right time is crucial. Where Final Fantasy Adventure had the player leveling up their power gauge to make their weapons stronger, Secret of Mana instead has the weapons themselves level up FF2 style, after using specific orbs, normally rewarded from defeating bosses, to craft improved versions. Likewise, once the player is granted access to magic, the various spell elements can also gain a new level every time the player reaches one of the Mana Temples. But perhaps the most significant addition to the sequel is the incorporation of multiple party members. FF Adventure just saw a few supporting characters temporarily join the party, and said characters were static, with no customization or even capacity for leveling up. But Secret of Mana sees Randy eventually traveling in a 3-person party for the majority of the game. The player can swap to control any of the 3 characters at the press of a button, and while characters not currently being controlled will act on customizable AI behavior, the player can also issue commands to any character on the fly by using various pop-up menus. But furthermore, once the dev team started incorporating a multi-character party into the game, they eventually realized that it would also be possible to add co-op gameplay. And thus, what is possibly Secret of Mana's biggest selling point was conceived: full multiplayer support, allowing 2 or even 3 people to play simultaneously, with the presence of a third player being made possible via the Super Nintendo's multi-tap peripheral. Yeah, the SNES had a multi-tap too, guys. It wasn't just a PlayStation thing. Secret of Mana, at least in single player, is hard for me to put into words. Like I said at the top of the video, this is a game with which I can't really seem to process my feelings. I certainly don't think it's a bad game, but I've played it twice now, both within the last year, and despite playing long enough to max out all my characters' levels, weapons, and spells, I never really reached a point where it felt like the game fully clicked with me. It took me almost a full 30 minutes to make heads or tails of the game's UI, for one thing. The menus are all laid out in a series of rings, which I'm sure at the time felt refreshing, but why are weapons, items, and spells on their own rings separate from stats and armor? It's not like spells or weapons have their own shortcut buttons, you still have to scroll to them regardless. And I can't begin to imagine what this would all be like in multiplayer. The game pauses every time you open a menu to cast spells or use items or whatever, and with 3 players, I can see that getting really irritating really fast. Look, I know the standard list style of menu design is boring, but it's also simple and easy to understand and smooth to navigate. I have no idea why game designers are so averse to just using freaking lists. I much prefer that over a bunch of flashy visual clutter. And can I also personally advocate that we petition for some sort of industry standard on which button scrolls which direction on a ring? I'm tired of having to guess whether pressing right will move me clockwise or counterclockwise. And while I'm at it, why is the default control scheme so weird here? I mean, you can change it in the options menu, so it's not like it's really a big deal, but B is confirm and Y is cancel? I could understand swapping A and B maybe, but like, what? The A button performs a dash, and I don't think I ever found any real practical use for this, considering you can only use it in a straight line, and it immediately drains the energy meter you could otherwise be using to attack. X and Y both open menus, Y for the character being controlled, and X to toggle your party members' menus. And I was constantly getting those mixed up because of course you would. It's all completely nonsensical. It also just kinda sucks that the screen doesn't center on the character you're controlling. It only scrolls when your characters approach the edge of the screen, and so you're often getting ambushed by enemies that you couldn't see ahead of time. I guess this was done for multiplayer purposes so that players can't be edged off the screen by other players, but I still thought it was a bit annoying. I couldn't help but notice a few pacing issues too. The first entire third or so of the game takes place entirely in the lower lands, repeatedly backtracking as you head to your various objectives. The next third of the game is split between the Upper Lands, Ice Country, and Imperial Lands. And then once you get access to your magical flying fur dragon, every remaining location in the game is shoved into the last stretch before the final dungeon. The pacing at the start of the game seems damn near glacial, but by the end you're being rapidly force-fed a seemingly random list of objectives with no real rhyme or reason connecting one to the other. It's like the game designers realized they hadn't given the player any chances to explore a majority of the world map and panicked, unable to come up with any real cohesive narrative tissue, and so they just gave you a bunch of fetch quests instead. Even worse, the end of each fetch quest has you scaling this mountain and talking to this NPC to be told your next objective, and they have you do this like 8 fucking times. This was easily my least favorite stretch of the game. But really, I think the biggest reason Secret of Mana left me so conflicted all comes down to the battle system. RPGs live or die on their battles. Most of the time spent in these games is going to be spent mindlessly killing things, and if that process is overly obtuse, complicated, or even just plain boring, it's not going to be a particularly great experience. Secret of Mana, like FF Adventure before it, took steps to break away from menu-driven turn-based combat that had thus far, in the eyes of many, been holding RPGs back. But Square was also clearly choosing to stick to what they knew best, and so a lot of RPG elements are still present in spades. Damage output is determined by a mix of stats and dice rolls. Characters gain EXP and level up, you buy new armor and restore HP and MP at inns, etc., etc. But at the same time, it's also trying to be a Zelda-style action-adventure with real-time weapon-driven combat, and those two game styles don't really mesh. At least, not in the way they're attempting here. Despite playing through this game 2 full times, I still always feel like I'm somehow doing something wrong, simply because enemies never react to my actions the way I would expect them to in a game like this. Even though you're visibly moving your characters around and swinging your weapons, making sprite-to-sprite contact with an enemy doesn't guarantee that your hit lands, since the game is still using turn-based JRPG dice rolls and arbitrary accuracy stats to determine whether you actually hit them or not, and this is just so at odds with what the player is actually seeing. Like, in a Zelda game, if my attack misses, it's because I aimed poorly, and I can accept that I made that mistake. Here, though, I can see that my weapon connected, but the game randomly decided it didn't count that time, and there's nothing I can do about that. In a traditional turn-based RPG, the player just sort of accepts that a lot of this stuff is all up to chance, but in an action game, which Secret of Mana clearly wants to be, incorporating blatantly randomized elements like this into standard combat is frustrating and disheartening even. Again, in Zelda, the number of hits required to kill each enemy is determined by two simple factors: which enemy I'm fighting and which weapon I'm using. If an attack of mine does no damage in Secret of Mana, it's really anyone's guess as to why. Am I not positioned to strike their hitbox correctly? Were they still in their mercy frames from their last attack? Are my stats simply too low to have any effect? Is that enemy just immune to physical attacks? The game doesn't clearly communicate any of this information to the player, and so trying to problem solve it can oftentimes feel hopeless. It all combines into a situation I've never really encountered before in a video game. The game itself may not necessarily be buggy, but the game design makes it feel buggy because it feels like nothing is working. The difficulty scaling also feels really skewed. Early on, before you're even given access to magic or any additional party members, the game places these slime enemies in your path that have high physical defense, can split up an unlimited number of times, and can poison you on contact. I get that the game maybe just wants you to run from them until you're better equipped, as this is an area you'll return to a few times over, but god damn it if I didn't spend several minutes beating my head against a wall trying to defeat even one of these things at first. Enemies in general can also just plain stun-lock you if you get outnumbered, and your AI party members aren't always great at getting you out of those situations. The Cave of Trials late in the game feels like a huge difficulty spike, with enemies that seem to be immune to everything I could possibly throw at them even though I was adequately leveled up. And a lot of the bosses are also really bad in terms of scaling. Oftentimes the most effective method to defeating bosses is to just spam whatever element of spell they're weak to, as bosses usually have high physical defense and odd hitboxes that make a physical assault tricky. And by doing this, most bosses are pretty easy, but if you're ever in a position where you're out of MP, you're basically screwed. And take this boss, the Wall Face, where you have to hit this eye in the middle while constantly taking assault from the two eyes on either side. One of the side eyes periodically heals the main eye, so you'd think taking that eye out would be the key to victory. But no, the main eye can just revive the side eyes whenever they die. The first time I got to this boss, I didn't have any MP left, since the enemies in the dungeon were resistant to physical attacks, and so I had used it all up already. And even with a naturally leveled party, simply playing through the game, fighting every enemy I came across, I still wasn't dealing nearly enough damage with my three characters to outpace the healing the boss was doing to itself. The boss's defense is so high, and its window of vulnerability opens so briefly, that there was simply no chance of me actually winning this fight without being able to spam magic. So, okay, clearly the bosses are designed under the assumption that you'll just use magic on them. Okay, fine. So, what happens when a boss is plopped in front of you before you're ever given any spells to begin with? Oh boy, let me tell you about the Spiky Tiger. The Spiky Tiger is the game's third boss. Second, really. The first boss is just a tutorial that you literally can't lose. And this guy is an absolute asshole. He spends most of his time camping just out of reach and spamming spells, and at this point you only have two long-range weapons to share among your three characters. And when he does finally get close enough for you to actually attack him, his attacks send him flying in unpredictable directions and can knock your characters to the ground for several seconds while he continues to just wail on you. This boss seems like it was designed under the assumption that you would just be able to spam spells on him, but he's placed at a point in the game where you don't have any spells yet. I have a full hour's worth of footage of nothing but me just trying to beat this one boss. And once I finally managed it, only one of my party members was still standing. While doing some Googling to find out what I might be doing wrong, I learned I'm definitely not the only person to hit a wall here, as both this and the aforementioned Wallface are repeatedly brought up as two of the worst bosses in the game. Your only real option for winning here is to grind levels and healing items beforehand and just pray that he takes it easy on you the next time. Absolutely atrocious game design. And indeed, throughout most of the game, oftentimes your only real option is to just grind out your levels in Magic. In fact, the walkthrough I was using would recommend sticking around and grinding out levels each time you upgrade a weapon or unlock a new spell, and no, I'm not going to do that. I shouldn't have to do that. First off, leveling weapons in general is just pretty useless past a certain point, since weapon level really only determines how much you can charge your weapon's power before attacking, and anything past level 2 or 3 is rarely worth it. Secondly, it's just a major pet peeve of mine with RPGs in general. If I'm doing everything I should be, defeating every enemy I come across, and shit, usually doing more than what the game is asking of me, why the hell should I ever need to grind? And sometimes grinding doesn't even help. The final boss is baffling to me. There's really no strategy for one thing, it's just a stat check more or less. But in addition to this, for narrative reasons, only Randy's weapon can actually hurt the thing. So your party members kind of just stand around being useless the whole time, and even at level 99, this fight took about 5 minutes longer than it really should have. So I mentioned earlier that the game isn't necessarily buggy, but I still encountered some pretty bad ones. Your AI party members are prone to getting snagged up on the scenery, which isn't necessarily a full-on glitch so much as just questionable AI programming, but there was a legitimate instance of one of my characters glitching into the scenery with no way to retrieve them, forcing a reset. One of the dragon bosses in the Pure Lands also decided to fly out of bounds where none of my weapons or spells could hit it, and then it refused to move at all, forcing me to reset. And in another instance, the game just flat out froze after I beat a boss, which, you guessed it, forced me to reset. And the game's somewhat buggy nature is speculated to be a result of its troubled development. See, Secret of Mana was originally planned for the then upcoming Super NES CD add-on, which Nintendo was in the works with Sony to produce. For reasons I'll no doubt get into in future videos, that ended up not coming to pass, and this left the future of Mana somewhat uncertain. The team briefly considered just cutting their losses and canceling the game, but instead they eventually settled on repurposing the game for standard SNES carts. And if you know anything about developing for CDs versus cartridges, you'll know this was easier said than done. In order to cram everything into the limited bytes of a cart, roughly 40% of the game's planned content was scrapped, and much of what had been completed up to that point needed to be redone from scratch anyway. The story was also significantly downsized. The final game sees almost no real character development, and perhaps more significantly, the idea of multiple story paths and endings had to be thrown out the window. Given the game's ambitious scope, this just wasn't going to be doable on a cartridge. And even the localization suffered from this unexpected hardware change. Ted Woolsey has lamented the stunted nature of Mana's English script, with most dialogue needing to be shaved down to its absolute most essential to fit the cartridge memory and text box limitations. Japanese is a very densely built language where entire words or even broad concepts can be expressed with just a handful of symbols, but English requires far more letters to express the exact same things. Woolsey described the act of chopping the game's script as akin to shuffling a novel. Combine that with the absurdly short 1-month deadline he was given to translate the entire game in time for the 1993 holiday season, and it's no wonder he's been quoted saying Mana's localization process practically killed him. Despite it all though, I can 100% understand why so many people consider this game a classic, and why it's so close to the heart of many RPG fans. For one thing, the game is gorgeous. Backgrounds are rich and lively, your party members are all these really pleasant pastel colors, and every sprite is full of detail and animated wonderfully. It's one of the best looking SNES games, full stop. The soundtrack is also damn good. While FF Adventure composer Kenji Ito was initially slated to return for Mana, he had to decline due to already working on several projects at the time. So instead, Hiroki Kikuta was brought on board, and Mana was his first time creating music for a video game. And man, he really went above and beyond. The usual process of creating music for these old systems would involve the composer writing song demos using his own instruments or synthesizers, which would then be sent off to the sound programmers, who then recreate those compositions using the built-in samples of the console's native sound chip. Kikuta, though, took a completely hands-on approach. The absolute mad lad hand-created each and every instrument sample himself using SNES dev kits so he could personally hear exactly how the final product would sound. and he reportedly at times worked 24-hour days writing and editing music. The score itself is inspired by natural landscapes and uses a lot of bells, woodwinds, and pianos to create not only beautiful sweeping pieces for the lovely scenery you'll be traveling through, but also lively, upbeat music for the various towns you'll find yourself in. He even used whale calls in the game's intro to communicate to the player right away that they were stepping foot into a whole new world. And he even synced up the opening theme with the fading of the title screen. The end product is truly a masterpiece, and Kikuta to this day considers it his favorite work. The game also just has an overall vibe to it that is absolutely infectious. The three main party members may not have much in the way of actual character arcs, thanks to the game's emergency downsizing, but all three are still pretty likable characters with clearly defined personalities and understandable motivations. Even though the dialogue and backstories in the game are very bare bones, when compared to the cast of, say, Final Fantasy V, I feel like I know way more about who these characters are as actual people. The Secret of Mana also just has a lot of charm and whimsy to it. Moogles show up as both NPCs and a status condition, which is a nice little nod to the game's Final Fantasy roots. And an entire dungeon of the game revolves around rescuing Santa Claus. And I don't mean like a mythical fantasy character who represents Santa Claus, I mean like Rudolph is there. This is actually just Santa Claus. And if that isn't just so fucking adorable. So, as for the question posed in the video title, did Secret of Mana win me over in the end? Well, honestly, I still don't know. I've played through the game twice now, and I don't feel any different now than I did the first time I finished it. I can see the appeal, for sure, and I understand what the game was trying to accomplish. But at the same time, it's not really something I can see myself revisiting anytime in the near future. I see the charm in it, I see the beauty, I see the ambition, but I think the final result is just a tad too clunky to hold up on its own. Unfortunately, I think where the game failed the most is in its battles, which is arguably the single most important aspect of a good RPG. But the game nails nearly everything else. Stunning visuals, beautiful music, charming world and characters. It may not be an amazing game per se, but it's absolutely a worthwhile experience.
Future.